Good morning. My name is Toby Heaps, and I'm the CEO of Corporate Knights. And it's my pleasure to introduce the panel that we'll be introducing in a few moments. And the topic we'll be discussing today, sustainability reporting, the next frontier in Canadian standard setting. As many of you who are with us today will know, language is integral and a necessary condition to inform action at scale. And fortunately, after many years of lots of groundwork getting laid, things are really coming together really quickly globally. And as part of that, there's a big role for Canada to play in getting everything in place here in our jurisdiction. So we're in for a pretty good discussion. I'd encourage all the participants, I know many of you are quite informed members of this discussion and shaping this discussion. Please add your comments, questions to the chat Q&A, and we'll get to them as best as we can during the session, and as many of them as possible after the session, so we can get everything answered. Before we get this underway, I'd just like to do a brief land acknowledgement. Corporate Knights honors the people and land of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. Ed Waitzer and Michael Jantzi, I think for many of you, and also John Godfrey, who will be asking the first question, are well known. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we are a little embarrassed that our panel is pale and male, but I hope we can, and I hope that you give us heck for that, and we definitely will be careful about not doing that again, and we're not making an excuse for that. But the people that we're bringing to you today have some real insight to add. Ed Waitzer has been on all sort of parts of the capital market spectrum. From his, I think the main thing, if you know one thing about Ed, is when he was the vice president at the Toronto Stock Exchange, he used to canoe over from Center Island in his canoe, portage down Bay Street, and then give it to the concierge to park. So anybody that can get a valet to park their canoe surely has some wisdom to share. After the TSX, Ed also played a role at the Ontario Securities Commission as chair. So he's kind of been at the portal or capital markets, the retail part of it, the institutional part of it, the store part, the self part, but also the regulatory part. And then in this role, his long career, is a lawyer, worked on many practical matters, and really helped to edge forward this whole stakeholder notion of the corporation, stakeholder responsibility notion of the corporation, which is now quite getting enshrined in law, both in Canada and abroad, and evolving norms and standards. Also, Ed is one of the sort of, he won't name names, but he's one of the people that many of the important people that make big economic decisions in this country rely upon when they have a problem, to think things through for his wisdom. So not just sort of the functional roles and the academic roles that he's played, but his wisdom. So I think you'll find he's a good choice for being at the helm of this discussion and this movement to get a sustainability standards board in Canada. Michael Jantzi started up some decades ago out of a basement office, and decided with true resolve and determination that he was going to make a real difference in bringing some order to the chaos of sustainability information from companies. And through his blood, sweat, and tears, and pure determination and resolve and integrity, built up one of the leading firms, really put Toronto on the map for global sustainability standard setting, from as far as the sort of private sector research and ratings entity goes. And now his company's research inform Morningstar's ratings and their fund ratings and fund products, really helped to move things. So a real Canadian success story. Really nice to have Michael with us. And John Godfrey, many of you will know his long career across many parts of the spectrum, editing newspapers, helming universities and colleges, and schools, French schools, and also is an influential member of Parliament and minister, where he was the sort of the leading light for sustainable development when he was in the when he was in Parliament, and was one of the people, but was the key person. Again, he may not toot his horn on this, but was the key person who galvanized the government caucus to get behind Kyoto when support was waning back in the day. So has long been a champion. So I think we'll have a lot to learn. We really welcome people's comments and questions as we go on. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ed Waitzer.
Just so everyone knows, the person who's really at the helm is Stephanie Fox, who's also on the call, who's providing support, whose name is spelled wrong, but who's been providing support for the committee. So I'm going to spend maybe 5 minutes just providing a broad overview, because I think we really want to get as much input from you as possible. The proximate causes of the committee are twofold. One is there hasn't been a review of standard setting on the traditional financial reporting and assurance side for almost a quarter of a century. For my sins, I was on the last review, and as a marker, the only substantive recommendation that wasn't accepted by what was then the CICA, now CPA Canada, following our last review, was the notion of setting up a separate legal entity as standard setter. So structurally moving standard setting out of CPA Canada. And I'm not saying that good or bad, it's just interesting. The second and more substantive reason for the review at this stage is the urgency of addressing sustainability standard setting, again, both on the reporting and assurance side. In many ways, I think the broad expectation is that those standards will and reporting will quickly surpass traditional financial reporting, and will also challenge the relevance of traditional financial reporting, and therefore cause some change on that side as well. The issues, of course, are more complex. There's a much broader range of stakeholders. The CPA profession doesn't have, at least at this stage, the same legislative or regulatory franchise with respect to reporting and assurance standards. So this is an area where there are lots of service providers already in the game and more likely to emerge. Having said that, CPA Canada is not unfamiliar with, I can't believe I used a double negative, I'm sounding like a lawyer. CPA Canada is familiar with setting and administering standards used by non-CPA. So, but the issues are so much different. They're systemic issues, whereas financial reporting has historically at least been at the firm level. And as I say, they engage a much broader range of stakeholders. So what has the committee done in order to attempt to have as robust a consultation as we can? We put together our report deliberately asking questions instead of taking normative views. In asking questions, we try to benchmark what has been done and is being done elsewhere in the world. Canada isn't ahead of the curve on these issues. There's lots of work being done elsewhere. And in fact, one of the issues that I think the committee will have to address is whether we make interim recommendations, just recognizing the need to sort of get on board quickly here. We did take a view with respect to a couple of issues. The only substantive in terms of normative issue is the question of whether there should be a separate Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. Most of you are aware that Canada decided some time ago to be a standards taker rather than maker with respect to financial reporting and assurance services. So we take IASB standards and adapt them to Canadian requirements. The thinking is the same will be the case with respect to sustainability standards. And as you know, the ISSB has just put out its first two framework standards. Our view is there is still value and And having a separate Canadian sustainability standards infrastructure is cost justified for the reasons we set out in the consultation paper: the ability to influence international standards, the ability to adapt those standards, the ability to apply those standards to the public sector, not-for-profit sector, which ISSB isn't addressing in its remit. So again, that's a very contentious issue, and we've heard lots of different views on that, but so I wanted to flag that as one area where we thought taking a view would provoke more discussion. The only other area where we've taken a view are what I would call contextual issues, which relate primarily to the unique rights of our Indigenous communities in Canada and Francophone communities, and issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to share, or at least do some thinking as a committee with respect to what we mean when we when we talk about the public interest. It's the term that kind of is easily debased, and so we thought we can't sort of put that out there without at least sharing some thought about what we think it means and inviting response to that. So those are areas where we've taken a view. In terms of our schedule, we intend to report out sometime this summer. The comment period is officially over, but anyone who asks for more time is given more time, and we are still actively engaging. We will be reconvening as a committee starting later this month to start to frame our report. And one of the interesting things that's happened in the comments that we've gotten back, we've been very proactive in trying to engage formally, informally, with as broad a range of stakeholders as possible. And I think we've been reasonably successful at that. And part of what's happened is, I described the fact that we did a bunch of benchmarking in putting together the consultation paper. To the extent that benchmarking is backward or present looking, I think we've been challenged in a lot of the feedback we've received to be forward looking. And I can give you some examples of that. One easy one is, and I'm sure others will come out in the discussion, is many jurisdictions are not setting up separate sustainability standards boards. Japan is, but others haven't yet. But when we look ahead, even in those jurisdictions, reasonable to expect that they will be. They've just decided that they've got to do something quickly for now, and doing something quickly means housing it within existing infrastructure. So that's almost a mundane example of the need to look forward. But other needs to look forward is thinking about what the reporting and assurance space is going to look like in terms of service providers, thinking about funding alternatives. Why don't I pause there, Michael? You'll probably pick up some things I've missed, and then look forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, I'm not going to point out as so much what you missed, but maybe build on some of the things that you talked about, Ed, because I do think it's really important context. And I think it is important to note that our recommendation in the consultation paper around the CSSB, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, was one of a substantive thing for us to do as a committee. And it was based, at least in part, on the consensus that the committee had. And if you think of the context in which we made that decision, our committee got underway last spring. So I think we felt the direction of travel in regards to sort of sustainability standards and reporting was, that the direction of travel was fairly clear. But it was only in November of last year when we had the announcement of the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And I think part of the committee's reasoning in putting the recommendation for a CSSB forward was, again, as Ed mentioned, it's consistent with the structure that we see in Canada around auditing and assurance and on accounting here. As Ed said, Canada has taken a decision that we're a taker of international standards, but just, you know, we have an accounting standards board in Canada that has a very good relationship with the International Accounting Standards Board. And as Ed mentioned, that's important because it not only allows us to have a close relationship for those standards that are coming our way, but it also allows Canadians then to have a more direct and impactful relationship with the IASB to bring Canadian perspectives to the global body. And so for us, especially when the ISSB was announced, and the International Sustainability Standards Board is going to sit squarely within that global governance structure. So the ISSB will sit alongside the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board. And so again, it made sense to us to have a Canadian equivalent to benefit from that flow of information both ways. And I think that was important. I also think it's important to note that our committee is being asked to comment on whether or not we think that the establishment of a CSSB is worthy. And so we've already made that recommendation at this point. Our committee, at this point anyway, doesn't believe our mandate extends to listing what those standards should be. Those are conversations that one would expect the CSSB itself would have. I think we may weigh in on broader governance questions around like how the committee would be set up, how it might be funded, as Ed mentioned, its membership structure and those types of things. So although we welcome your feedback on the types of things the CSSB might want to consider in this forum or others, I think it's important to note that that's not something that our committee, I don't expect anyway, is going to weigh in on in any significant manner. But I do want to pick up on a couple of things that Ed said in regards to the decision that the committee made to put forward the recommendation in favor of the establishment of a CSSB. And as Ed said, I think there's a couple of things that we feel we can, that are unique to the Canadian experience that again underpin our thinking. And I think, as Ed mentioned, if you look at the ISSB now, generally those standards are going to be focused on, companies in the markets, in the public markets, and at least initially probably on the equity side. And in Canada, as Ed mentioned, there may be a broader range of stakeholders that are interested in sustainability standards. Again, the ISSB is pretty laser focused on its primary user group, which are really investors and other allocators of capital. So that was something that went into our determination, but also the public sector, obviously, may have a more significant role in the Canadian landscape than it does in some other jurisdictions globally. So there was that conversation about the coverage of sustainability standards, or what groups those standards may or may not apply to, and then on user groups. But I think it was also really important from a committee's perspective that we understand that whether the issues are covered under the ISSB frameworks or proposed frameworks or not, there was very likely going to be the need to take a closer look to ensure that those reporting standards were fit for purpose for the Canadian experience. And so Ed already mentioned, I think, one of the things that has really been, at least, and I'll say very personally, just a very meaningful and important discussion that we've had at the committee that spans much more broadly than the CSSB. But again, Indigenous rights have been front and center and have really been a foundational element of all of our conversations at the committee. And as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, I mean, Indigenous rights are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. And so if we're looking at Indigenous issues, the ISSB, as an example, has already indicated that it will be using the SASB framework as it expands its remit beyond the initial focus on climate. And while the SASB framework certainly does touch on Indigenous issues to a certain extent, I think one could very easily argue that the extent to which Indigenous issues are embedded in the SASB framework may not be appropriate or fit for purpose in the Canadian situation. Again, given that those rights are enshrined in the Constitution here, given our economic base and the importance that Indigenous peoples play across that landscape, given the fact that from certain jurisdictions, including the federal government, some provinces have now embedded UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, into what they're doing. So that would be one example where we would expect the CSSB might take a closer look on, and again, from our perspective, felt the recommendation to have a body like the CSSB was justified. But also, again, even issues that are getting a lot of attention globally, as they should, like climate change, and certainly if you've taken the time to look through the draft protocols and proposals and now guidelines that the ISSB has released on climate, and if you've read those, you'll know that the ISSB is not starting from scratch. The foundation for their climate reporting is the TCFD and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. So those, I'll argue, are broadly robust. There can be some disagreement about that, but again, from a Canadian perspective, there may be some things that the CSSB would want to look at to again ensure that in our economic reality and our political realities of living in a federal system, that the climate disclosures, again, are fit for purpose here. There's many examples we could use, but I think I'll just point to a report that was brought out earlier this year by the Bank of Canada and OSFI. There were a lot of interesting, from my perspective, findings coming out of that report, but the one, and it may seem obvious, but I think it's important in regards to the CSSB, is that when we're looking at a transition to a lower carbon economy, the impacts on an economic base like Canada can be quite different than it is in some other parts of the world, and so standards may have to reflect that. The fact that we live in a federal system, and the fact that carbon intensive activities take place in different degrees across this country in different ways is something that may need to be reflected. I also would argue, and this is maybe not something that we talked about at the committee as much, but the fact is that, especially I think acute in Canada and important in Canada, is that when we're talking about a transition to a lower carbon economy, it's not just about carbon emissions. It has to be about people. It has to be about communities. It's this just and orderly transition. And the fact is that, again, if you look at the foundational climate standards that are there, there's not as much on the just transition side, the social side of the transition, as we might deem to be important in Canada, as an example. So those are a couple of things that may be part of the mix, and again, are just simply examples that underpinned our committee's conversations and the decision that at this point in time, a CSSB makes a lot of sense here. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to take questions. As Ed mentioned, we're mostly focused here on getting your input, and that I expect will be a process that continues until the final report comes out, even though the quote formal time has ended at the end of last month. So looking forward to the discussion here today.
Thanks, Michael. And we have lots of questions coming in the comment, some good questions, material questions. But before we get into those, apropos to both what you and Ed mentioned in terms of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board applying to public sector institutions as well as publicly traded companies, sort of beyond the remit of the International Sustainability Standards Board. John Godfrey has a lot of experience in this area and has some insights and I think an interesting question to ask. So John, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and I'll try and be brief. My questions are going to be about two issues. One is how the meaning of sustainability has evolved over time, and how we now are in the world of sustainable development as opposed to pure sustainability, and what challenges that poses. And I'm going to be asking that question of the experts. And the second question, which arises from it, is where is the Canadian government, the public sector, in all of this, in framing the discussion about sustainability and sustainable standards? And I'm going to argue that they are making life more difficult for a response in terms of producing sustainable standards. A little bit of history here. Back in 2008, when I was just before I left Parliament, I was able to sponsor a private member's bill called eventually the Federal Sustainable Development Act, which got all party consent. Even the Conservative government, minority government, John Baird, who was the minister at the time, agreed. And essentially what it did was to set up a process. It said that every 3 years, the government of Canada would have to come up with a sustainable development strategy, which would have to work out with the Federal Environment Commissioner. So the first report didn't say what the strategy was, it just said there shall be one. And I knew that once I created a process within government, which had to keep coming back every 3 years and being critiqued by the Environment Commissioner, that I would set off something that couldn't be controlled and that they'd have to do it for the rest of their lives, right? Typical government operation. So I picked that one right. And in fact, exactly as I had hoped, we're now up to the 5th Sustainable Development Strategy for 2022-2026, which is good news. The problem has been since then that both because of the United Nations, the creation, I guess starting in Paris in 2015, of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which took the word from sustainability far beyond the environment into everything from trying to eliminate world poverty, to hunger, to reducing inequalities. All of these were very worthwhile objectives, but suddenly there were 17 goals, each of which started with the adjective sustainable and development. And so the problem then became, well, if we're creating, as I had, a renewed sustainable development process for the strategy, what are you supposed to do with all of these other less environmental, less climate-oriented standards? And then at the same time, and I would argue this hasn't been helpful either, for very worthwhile purposes, we started talking about environmental, social, and governance goals, ESG, as being part of what we mean by sustainability. And yet while social goals, again, are very worthwhile and also embedded in the UN goals, they're not the same thing. We want to maintain our gains in defeating inequality, but it's not the same thing as dealing with the survival of the planet. And so I guess one of the challenges has been that the Canadian government, and here's an example of how this stuff can go wrong, the process which I created, which keeps getting renewed, is being driven by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Canada. But what they've chosen to do, for example, in the latest report, is to try and comment from, even though they're the Environment and Climate Change Department, on that whole range of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So just for example, they feel they have to say something about eliminating world poverty, and Environment and Climate Change Canada has interpreted that as being support Canada's preparedness for natural disasters and emergencies, which frankly doesn't compute. But they felt they had to fill in all the gaps. And so it became very difficult from that point of view. More complicated is the fact that the overall responsibility within the government of Canada, though, for forwarding the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations rests with the Ministry of Families, Children, and Social Development. And they in turn have prepared something called Agenda 2030, which is for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And they have come out with a different set of definitions about what those 17 Sustainable Development Goals mean. So here you have two different line departments, environment and social development, each defining for their own purposes 17 different Sustainable Development Goals. And at the heart of government, there is no central agency, not finance, not the Prime Minister's office, not the Privy Council office, which is prioritizing within that, which is selecting and saying, this is what we mean by sustainability. And so I guess my question to the panelists is, if the Canadian government isn't clear about what defines sustainability and sustainability standards, does this make the work of a future Canadian Sustainability Standards Board for the corporate and financial sector more difficult? Because they're not sure in the financial sector what they're being asked to do, because the government of Canada isn't even sure what sustainability means for each of those 17 goals. Maybe I'm creating a bit of a problem here which doesn't exist, but I see this as very difficult to respond to.
John, I'll try to respond, but I think you answered your question with the last comment, which is, and it's not unusual where these kinds of issues get solved in the private sector rather than in the public sector. So, sustainability reporting has been driven by the private sector, obviously with input from various public institutions, and I think it's reasonable to assume for a whole bunch of reasons that will continue to be the case. So our focus is less on government, although we have representatives, as I think Michael alluded to, from OSFI and the Canadian Securities Administrators participating with the committee. We have a former Deputy Minister of Finance on the committee. But I think our assumption is that these are going to be private sector solutions. We also assume that whatever standards are adopted will apply to public sector institutions. So part of what we're thinking about, which is the case with respect to financial reporting and assurance standards. So hopefully that responds to your question.
Thank you.
There's some great comments and questions going on in the chat room. I hope we can kind of move the chat room into the live room, because I can't walk and chew gum at the same time.
Sure. I think it's this sort of point at the front end about what is sustainability is pretty important, and it would be interesting to get your Michael's perspective on it. The way that the international, for everyone who's with us, a lot of people know this, but the International Sustainability Standards Board has confined its sort of vision to what's material, from an investor perspective, and maybe simplifying that a little bit, but it's not the sort of more broader remit of anything that's important for the whole realm of stakeholders that companies impact. And it's not a bad place to start maybe, but Charles Cho, professor of accounting, one of the leading sort of sustainability accounting professors in the world, has some big concerns about this. And we know that there's an arrangement set up between the Global Reporting Initiative and International Sustainability Standards Board. And the Global Reporting Initiative has metrics that cover the whole realm of stakeholders. And Ed and Michael, you both talked about the Indigenous issue, some social just transition issues, the Francophone issues. And I know the remit that you have isn't to solve all the nitty-gritty, is to figure out the standard setting process. But in figuring out the standard setting process, how do you define that? Is it a sort of kind of like a ISSB plus, we pick the GRI that make the most sense for us in Canada and don't restrict ourselves to that principle of materiality? Or because it's going through, do we have to restrict ourselves to that principle of materiality, I guess is the key question with the CSSB.
Can I?
Go ahead, Michael.
So it's a I think, Toby, you've hit on obviously one of the key debates or discussions at a global level. I mean, my perspective on this is that there's what you've said is broadly true in regards to scoping the landscape, although I think the gap between what's being called single materiality and double materiality is not as wide a chasm as some people make it out to be. And so I think, I mean, there's no question. I don't speak for the ISSB, but I know a little bit in regards to their thinking on this. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the ISSB is focused on a primary user group, which is investors and other allocators of capital. And you're absolutely right that their initial focus is focusing on setting standards, focusing on sustainability metrics that could have an impact on the evaluation of enterprise value. There's no question. But for critics, let's just say, of the ISSB to suggest in any way that they are not aware of the fact that some, I'll call them double material or impact-oriented metrics, do not have present risks at a portfolio or a systemic level isn't the case. So they're aware of that. They're also aware of the fact that a growing number within their quote primary user group care about double materiality. And so even the fact that, you know, if you look at their primary user group, I can make a strong case that institutional investors, maybe not uniformly globally, but certainly I would argue increasingly the data shows that they care about not only looking at the impact that ESG issues have on their own portfolios, but the impact that their portfolios have on the communities in which they live and operate and environmental issues. And certainly the data clearly shows that retail and wealth audience, which is an important part of that primary audience, clearly is concerned about outcomes, not just financial return. So the question becomes, what's your theory of change and how much can you handle at the same time? And so, you know, I think the ISSB has taken a building block approach to this. Start with climate, move to ESG more broadly, and what comes next, I mean, I'm certainly in no position to say, but I do think that the MOU that they've signed now with GRI indicates the fact that there's a strong market and regulatory message that says we need globally aligned standards. So we'll have to see where that goes. Now, your question was, what will the CSSB's role on that or view on that be? Well, I'll now pass it to Ed because, I mean, I would say that's a CSSB agenda item. I'm not sure it's for our committee to say one way or the other, although Ed may have a different view in regards to our capacity and willingness to weigh in on it.
Well, I would make two quick comments. One is, I think we were pretty explicit, obviously not as explicit as some would have liked us to be from the comments, but we were pretty explicit in the consultation paper that we saw the relevance of sustainability reporting and assurance services as extending beyond suppliers and users of capital. And we also said we intend to proactively engage with a much broader range of stakeholders, in part because of that. So you know, the other, and the second point is a personal observation, which is when you look at these issues over time and think about where we're heading, I think there's basis for expecting that some of these issues kind of merge out, because how we think about materiality, forget about single and double materiality, how we think about materiality, how we think about sustainability, how we think about systems in general and interdependence within those systems is evolving so quickly that, you know, some of these issues I think are rear view issues as opposed to forward-looking issues, and I think that's confirmed by the agreement with GRI that ISSB, you know, my sense of where ISSB is heading is very much as Michael articulated, but we'll see.
Interesting. And what's the buy-in like in your consultations you've done so far? We had a question with the buy-in is from the CPA, but also from corporate Canada. And it'd be interesting just to that earlier question around the size of companies, because this reporting could be more of a burden for smaller companies with less capacity if it's a whole avalanche, if there's any kind of consideration. And I know some of these questions are kind of CSSB questions in the nitty-gritty, so feel free to sort of punt them there. But I think people would be curious to hear both your and Michael's views on those.
When you say buy-in, all we can do is, we've had, I think, 60 comment letters so far, which isn't really indicative because we've also done webinars. We've done, we've made it clear to, for instance, yesterday we were on the phone with one of the big 4 accounting firms who indicated they would rather not file a formal written submission on the record. So we said, fine, we'll talk to you. And yesterday afternoon, after that call, we got a formal written submission from one of the other big 4 firms. So we have certainly had the point raised about undue regulatory burden on not only smaller issuers and again, private as companies as well, but also not-for-profits raised. So it's an issue that we have to think about in terms of cost benefit when applying these standards. We haven't addressed that yet, but that's certainly on the table. I think we're going to end up with a pretty robust consultation process. The challenge is to get comments that help us come up with actionable recommendations. Lots of people have very strong views on sustainability, all of which are interesting and relevant, but some of which may be relevant to our immediate objective, which is to come up with actionable recommendations in a very short time frame.
Yeah. Michael, would you like to add anything to that, or? Okay, I'll move on to a question from Parag Puri. His question, it's in the Q&A, is with respect to materiality and KPIs of sustainability, what standards and targets will the CSSB be adopting, global or internal, and how will they be auditable?
Well, again, we are not going to be, our job isn't to come up with standards, but our job is to propose or recommend how those standards should be developed for Canada, including assurance standards. So part of what we're thinking about is, how to go about, in each of Europe and in the US with the SEC, have sort of put their oar in the water as to initial thoughts about qualifications for providing and the need for assurance, and we will certainly be addressing that in our report.
And some of these questions, because I think there's a defined role that this initiative has in terms of creating the body, and then there's the second level of questions about what the body will do that people are naturally going to be curious about, because that's where the rubber hits the road. So just sort of respecting some of the questions, but one from Bob Willard, author of The Sustainability Advantage. I thought a lot about from the business perspective about really bringing standards into the business management frame matrices. He's asking if the government of Canada should be required to report annually on this framework as well. And I know, John, you might have some perspective on this. There are currently reporting requirements around sustainable development, but this is a more specific question.
Our expectation is that sustainability standards will apply to public sector institutions and eventually to the government of Canada as well. The government of Canada, has dabbled with sustainability standards in a bunch of ways, as John has described. But our expectation is that these standards will be adapted to apply to public sector institutions as well. That's the basis on which we put out our consultation paper.
That would suggest, though, that in a sense, the government would consciously have to carve out those parts which relate to financial reporting, and so it could align and segregate that part of the activity as opposed to its larger commitment to sustainable development reporting. But they'd have to be quite purposeful in doing so, I think.
Yep.
There was also a question from Michael Prue around enforcement for non-compliance, and you addressed part of that in the comments, but maybe just to bring into the live chat too. I guess that would be part of the assurance standards or component, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I sort of didn't really deal with it in a fulsome way in the chat because I need to think about it a bit. In the current model, enforcement is dealt with through the provincial institutes, the provincial professional bodies, and then on the audit side, through the Canadian Public Accountability Board, which the CEO of which is an observer in our committee. The interesting, so yes, we clearly need to think about, you can't have standards without having enforcement mechanisms, and we clearly need to think about enforcement mechanisms. The added complexity here is that the range of service providers are going to be much broader, including a bunch of service providers that, unless they voluntarily attorn to the jurisdiction of the provincial institutes, and the provincial institutes say we're happy to take it on, we're going to need something additional to deal with that, and we haven't, so we'd welcome thoughts about that. It's a great question.
And in terms of just kind of a general sense of how this might roll out on a timeline perspective, Grant Lowe had a question about transition period for the rollout. Is there pilot feedback, amendments? How do you sort of, the world can't predict the future, but how do you see this kind of rolling out over the next 18, 24 months?
Well, what I suggested in the opening remarks, and this is something we hadn't thought about while we were preparing the consultation paper, but I suspect are going to be thinking about very soon, is let's just walk through sort of a calendar. If we report out this summer, in the best of scenarios, CPA Canada or whoever else, because it may engage others, will decide what to do with our recommendations, say, and implement or not within a year, let's say. That's optimistic, I would have thought. Yeah. Which raises the question, what do we do in the interim when ISSB has already published 2 major sets of standards? The SEC has sort of upped the ante, and presumably that will challenge the Canadian Securities Administrators to do likewise. IOSCO is actively engaged with ISSB. So the world is moving on, and my guess is, but we haven't discussed this as a committee, we will probably be compelled to feel the need to make interim recommendations to sort of bridge us over. And that may be something short of a separate board, or I'm not sure. It could be a bunch of different things, but I think we're likely facing a 2-step process just because we are being overtaken by events, to use the British public sector phrase.
So Ed, yeah, just building on that, I think there's a recognition at our committee and more broadly that when it comes to sustainability standards, timeliness is of the essence, and that, I mean, I don't consider myself an expert in financial reporting by any stretch of the imagination, so that even for me, it's been a learning experience in learning that there's tension there for those that are focused more on the financial reporting side, where the time it takes to sometimes work through some of these issues from the discussion stage through to the implementation stage. Toby, for you and I who've worked, and John worked in sustainability, we recognize like right now we're a space that's evolving and innovating exceptionally quickly. And as Ed said, events have overtaken us, and so there's an acknowledgement of that, but there is a tension there, and it's an interesting one, I think, between sustainability and financial reporting, at least historically.
Toby, can I just make one point, because
Yeah.
Prakash has raised something in the chat a couple of times that, and it goes back to some of John's comments. It's interesting that standard setting historically in this space has been private sector, right? And that's what when I mentioned, it's quite remarkable that generally accepted accounting and auditing principles have been developed by the accounting profession, but then have the statutory weight of securities legislation saying reporting issuers have to comply. And that's not unusual. The same thing applies with respect to building codes and safety standards, and typically standard setting has been a private sector activity, with government then in effect providing the statutory authority for those standards. And it's sort of a different form of self-regulation, but presumably based historically on the theory that those closer to the ground are better able to develop relevant and responsive standards. So I don't think what we're talking about with respect to sustainability is any different than what has been the case in terms of it's not likely to be led by the public sector. Where the public sector will come in is when IOSCO and the prudential regulators say these standards are required for reporting issuers, financial institutions, and it'll work through the chain, because so giving the standards the force of law will be for sure a role of the public sector.
It'd be really interesting to get both your and Michael's perspective on this, because one of the key parts of this is going to be on taxonomy, classifying, what percent of revenue CapEx companies are making that falls into the sustainability box as opposed to the non-sustainability box, sort of like what the EU is doing on the taxonomy side. And it's like a next generation segmented reporting, I guess, demarcating what's sustainable. Do you see something in Canada? So we're going to need a taxonomy to reference for that. Do you think that shakes out in a way where we just take the EU, or is it something that comes out of the federal government, or is it something that comes out of somewhere else?
Well, that's $1 million plus question, Toby. I'm going to give you the good news, bad news from my perspective. I guess the good news is that we'll have a living, breathing example, and coming out of Europe. Learning by doing would be a kind way to put it. But they are learning, for better or for worse. We'll see where the outcomes are, and they're going to have to adapt along the way. So I think that if that's something that we will need to grapple with, and it's not, I would largely agree with you. It's as Ed would say, like Wayne Gretzky was focused on where the puck is going. It's probably where the puck is going, and we will have to grapple with it. And again, the good news is that we may have some playbooks that can lay the foundation for what we're doing. And it's not just the EU, as you're well aware. There are taxonomies being built in other jurisdictions, so we may have multiple playbooks. The bad news is, I guess, as everyone on this call is aware, the establishment of a Canadian sustainability taxonomy has been wrought with some challenges. And so, for whatever reason, and I, wasn't involved in those processes, but so it's not an easy thing to achieve. But again, once you move into an environment from a nice to have into a need to have, I think it focuses people's attention differently. And again, if we're in a need to have environment for that type of thing, alongside having some playbooks and learning from the mistakes of others, if you will. I mean, I'm optimistic that certainly we would be able to get there.
And is it something that comes out of a federal government body, or is it something that comes out of a non-government body, do you think?
I think it's multi-stakeholder, but that probably reflects more personal bias than anything else.
Interesting. Okay, well, this has been a really interesting conversation. We haven't got to everything. We will share the chat with everybody that joined the call, and encourage anybody who has additional thoughts, comments, ideas to share them. We'll provide that information in our follow-up email for this, for where those can go. But just before we close out, it would appreciate if we could just sort of get closing thoughts from Ed and Michael, and if you're willing, John, it'd be interesting closing thoughts for you too. We just have a few minutes, so kind of 60 seconds or so would be ideal. Do you want to go first, Ed?
Yeah, and thank you for the chats, and if you can send them around, happy to try to respond to those that I haven't responded to. More importantly, I'd urge you, like, this is a great group, so thanks to Chris, Toby, Corporate Knights for convening this forum. It's probably the largest group we've had, and some really thoughtful questions. I'd encourage those of you who are inclined to sort of make your views known, and whether that's sending comments, which we'll take even though the comment period is expired, or shooting Michael or me or Stephanie emails with your thoughts, or asking to set up a call. We are wide open and anxious to engage.
Yeah, and I would just add, I always feel that when I sit on panels like this, and we may be, what did you say, male and pale, but for me, it's an honor to be on with all of you. I learn more than I think I've imparted. And so I appreciate the input from people. I've been following the chat a little bit, and I find it, I appreciate it, and I know the committee will, and I'll just echo Ed's comments. Please continue to engage, and because it's so helpful for us as a committee to inform our agenda and our discussions as we move forward. So thank you.
My comment would simply be that, first of all, as a historian, apart from being a recovering politician, it's useful to be reminded of the kind of dialogue which has traditionally taken place between the private sector, as Ed was reminding us, in establishing standards which then the government takes on board and reinforces with legislation. What that speaks to, I think, is what should be a positive attitude between the two sectors, between the public sector and the private sector. I don't think that these should be seen as antagonistic, but as working together for the greater good of us all. And so the more open that dialogue is, and I do think that the federal government does need to be challenged on this crazy dual sustainability standard development process for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But I think it can be a very positive conversation, and I encourage Michael and Ed to carry on with them, because I think it'll be better for the country if we take a positive view of it.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, for my takeaway on this is more has happened in the last 2 years than happened in the last 20 years. And I think more will happen in the next 2 years than has happened in the past 2 years by significant amounts. And so a new language is happening. We're having to learn, as Michael said, we're doing this, it's a live performance. We're having to learn how to talk while we walk, and really appreciate everyone here today helping contribute to this this new lexicon that's coming into being. So thanks, and we look forward to staying in touch, and have a great rest of the week. Take care.